Chris, $37 million in pay raises. Can you
Yeah.
walk us through what's going on at the CBC? Because this is just ridiculous.
Yeah. Big time ridiculous. So, folks might remember back when the CBC was getting in a lot of hot water over bonuses. So, the CBC was handing out millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of bonuses to their upper staff and also just the rank and file. And people were getting pretty upset by this because, understandably so, taxpayers are strapped. Why are we handing out bonuses at the state broadcaster? They were so mad about it that there was an unprecedented amount of scrutiny. Then CEO Catherine Tate was dragged in front of the parliamentary committee and grilled about bonuses. Now, a few cute slash stupid things happened at that committee. One, Tate tried to say, oh, these aren't actually bonuses. There's some other euphemistic term. But what was funny here, Carson, is that the Taxpayers Federation, we had the documents. We had the FOI data. The CBC called them bonuses. So
Now, we're
I
not
know.
giving out bonuses unless you read our internal financial documents where we talk about all the bonuses we're giving.
Yeah, exactly. And to put a price on this, okay, we're talking so many millions of dollars. Some folks might remember that the CBC and its cheerleaders like to defend themselves as the great defenders of Indigenous programming.
Right.
You know, if the CBC weren't here and funded with $1.4 billion per year from taxpayers, who would cover Indigenous programming? Who indeed? How about the APTN, the
Right.
Aboriginal People Television Network, which
The entire
mostly is,
network, the entire network whose mandate is to cover First Nations, Métis, and Inuit affairs, right? Like
yep,
we have a special service to do just that.
yep, and it's almost entirely privately funded.
Yeah.
And frankly, they've got some real kick-ass journalism over there. I would strongly recommend people tune in. They even broadcast in First Nations languages.
Yeah.
Like, they do a great job. The CBC, back to this point of bonuses, the CBC was spending more on its bonuses than it was on Indigenous programming. So I know, don't let them get away with that. So we didn't. There was a huge push from tax fighters and even regular people writing in. Even the cheerleading group, Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, which is really just like a social club for CBC fans, they weren't happy. They said that handing out bonuses, especially now, is unbecoming of a public broadcaster.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and at the
yeah,
same time that they were handing out these bonuses, I remember it was right before Christmas. And haven't they just laid off like a whole whack of CBC journalists? So it was one
yeah,
of those things, like they weren't just screwing over taxpayers by taking these massive bonuses while families are struggling, but they were also like literally handing out pink slips to the journalists to give the managers and the producers and the directors these giant bonuses. Like that's not good journalism. That's not how you should run a network if your goal is to provide news and information to the Canadian people. Like that's a get rich quick scheme for executives.
yeah. What we see happening at the CBC is almost what you would expect if the government ran a media company.
Yeah, it's a great line, Chris, and it's absolutely true. And can we actually dive into some of those staffing numbers for a second? Because I think it would blow people at home away to hear how many managers and producers there are compared to journalists and, like, the useful folks.
Yeah, exactly. So I actually had to grab my notepad because it's almost impossible to believe. Quickly, there's a little kind of scuttlebutt or anecdote that goes around what I would call normal newsrooms outside of the CBC, that for every one reporter there is in a normal newsroom, there's like four at the CBC, and they all have like more than a dozen managers. Turns out that's true. So documents obtained by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation show just how thick the middle management is at the CBC. It's going to blow your mind. The CBC has 250 directors, 450 managers, 780 producers. That's just the tip of the iceberg, folks. I strongly recommend you go to taxpayer.com and click on the story about the CBC being big management heavy because it blew my mind. These numbers are double what I was even fearing. And they had more on there too, Carson. There was like architects and like lead architects. My favorite was an advisor. I looked up what an advisor would do at CBC, and apparently they just wander around like these sages and like opine on everything from like Second World War history to DEI practices.
Well, we need more. We need more of those advisors. What is the state broadcaster going to do without the gurus in the house? And Chris, it's important for the folks at home to realize that those numbers, like those 250 directors, 450 managers, 780 producers, those are only the ones making 100 grand or more. Like, come on. And Chris,
Yeah.
why does this matter to taxpayers? Right? And
Well,
go for it.
it matters to taxpayers because we're the ones paying the bills. And like to your point exactly, I know as a former producer, I did want to point out we know that producers are often the ones in there doing the work. They do the
Totally.
prep work, they do the previous questions, that sort of stuff. The point here is that the state broadcaster has 780 of them. For people who don't do media interviews, if you do like a normal talk radio media interview, it is often the host themselves that is reaching out to contact you. Or at best, there's one producer who's like doing like octopus things, doing 8 things in the control room. One. You get a call from the CBC, there's like 4 producers you're dealing with. You have to do a pre-interview and then another pre-interview and then a preparatory question and answer. Like it is ridiculously wasteful. And to your point exactly, these are just the ones that are making more than $100,000 per year. And that list has ballooned by more than 300%
Yeah.
since 2015. So, to put that quickly, since Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was elected in 2015, the middle management bloat, I call it the blob at the CBC, who's making more than 100 grand per year, has grown by 300%.
Yeah. Chris, I was talking just last weekend to a buddy of mine who's in the newspaper business. He was saying that just about everyone that leaves their newsroom goes to become a producer with the CBC. Because small town newspapers, they can't compete with the, what is it, $1.4 billion that CBC takes from journalists every year. So the
Yeah.
small town papers, the community newspapers that write about, your local chili bake-off, they can't keep people because the CBC poaches them with these giant taxpayer funded salaries. That's bad for everyone. That means you're not getting local news, and it means taxpayers are on the hook for more middle management at the state broadcaster.
I'm really glad you brought that up. And it's such a real example because it's obviously coming from a real person who's sharing that with you. And it's so true. I'm going to go into the weeds for a second here, but it's really important, okay? Because it's pertinent to our fight against the CBC. The CBC's mandate, when it was created, was to broadcast. It was to broadcast news and weather and a little bit of entertainment to compete with the big powerhouses of soap opera radio shows that were coming out of places like Chicago and New York. That was almost 100 years ago, okay? Their mandate was to broadcast. Fast forward, and we've got the internet. What the CBC started doing was typing stuff and writing stuff and having articles online. Again, on one side, totally funded by the taxpayer with $1.4 billion this year. And on the other side, they started eating up the space, the ad revenue space game for those local newspapers you just mentioned there. So they were really eating the lunch of what I would call the small print guys. And to your point, they do cover really fun stuff like local chili bake-offs. But in all seriousness, if you've got one local small town newspaper, that's the only person covering courts. That's the only person covering City Hall.
Totally.
Like, brutally important here. And so I'm so glad you mentioned this when it comes down to waste at the CBC, because it's this all-encompassing octopus of waste. And that's actually what led to our Online News Act.
Mhm.
So take those print guys that you were talking to, and they're sitting there saying, oh my gosh, wow, the CBC's posting print stuff. They're eating our lunch. We have to get more ad revenue. Government, please help us. That was a big mistake. So the government helped in the best way the government does by screwing up. They went to Facebook and said, hey, we noticed that you have links that is bringing people to these news sites. We want to charge you a tax every time you have a link up there. Facebook said, go pound sand. Now, all of these small newspapers aren't getting any of that traffic anymore,
Yeah,
meaning
and
they're
I
not landing there with eyeballs. So it's a huge, huge, huge waste of money in like a multi-dimensional way at the CBC.
Yeah, and Chris, like you and I have both spoken or personally to journalists who are going through this, who
Yeah.
are seeing their small town newsrooms, not even small towns, Kamloops here in
Yep.
BC, fairly big city. It lost its paper after this online news ban because of it, right? So this is actually impacting not just journalists, but real communities across Canada. Now, Chris, I know some of the journalism that we taxpayers pay for at the CBC, and I use journalism loosely in at least some of the cases, raises some eyebrows. And I think you brought an example today, didn't you?
I did. And before we hit record for folks listening, Carson and I agreed we're going to make a special show of dumb stuff that the CBC is covering because we think it's fair game. Because frankly, you're paying for it. Reminder, the CBC this year is taking $1.4 billion from Canadians. Put another way, that could pay for the full-time salaries of about 7,000 paramedics plus 7,000 nurses combined. But instead, it's going to the CBC. Now, I'm bringing up this story here. Okay. Don't know if you guys can read that. It says, here's my best CBC voice. People often miscalculate the impact of climate choices like owning a dog. Study says, owning a dog, avoiding plane flights among most important for climate, and were among the most underestimated.
Sorry, can I jump in, Chris? So that's a ridiculous headline. I don't think my German Shepherd puppy Molly is leading to the apocalypse. But I also saw something really interesting when you held that up. The byline. Can you point out something about the byline there?
Sure can, which is why I am pointing this out in the first place. You're right, it's totally silly to go after people's pets. Like, please save Molly. And you haven't sent me a picture in a while, by the way, so send me one. This is really important there. That byline, the Associated Press. The Associated Press is an agency run out of New York City.
Which, sorry, and I need to check my notes here. I've got the
Okay,
notebook handy. New York City, not in Canada.
yeah. So, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the one who tries to hide behind maple syrup and Anne Murray every time we try to say, could you quit blowing taxpayers' money, please, is posting this kind of stuff saying you should be ashamed and scolded for owning a puppy. Further, you should be ashamed and scolded for owning a puppy that eats meat. They're just doubling down on this nonsense, right? But further, they're paying to run American nonsense on the Canadian website. So this is a huge waste of money from every which angle you look at it. And further, this is the news people can use. This is the news that they're paying for to get scolded for having a pet. They can go pound sand.
Yeah, well, thank goodness someone is buying and repackaging American news stories about how owning a puppy is killing the planet. What would we do without the hard work and repackagers over at the state broadcaster? Chris, any last thoughts?
I just wanted to encourage everybody to keep up this fight because we were this close to defunding the CBC, and it would be a monumental achievement to make that happen. Right now, I'm telling you, they're getting all big in their britches again. I promise you. And I can tell that because of one key thing. They replaced Catherine Tate. There's a new CEO. You would think that after all of the drubbing they took, they would have learned their lesson and started the new CEO at a lower rate. You know what? We were paying them too much money. Nope. New CEO still being paid at CEO level 7. So she is now being paid close to $500,000 per year. That is more than the Prime Minister of Canada. That is more than any premier of any province in this country. You're paying some bureaucrat to head up the state broadcaster that kind of cash. So I just want to encourage people, continue to email your MP and tell them to defund the CBC.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Let us know in the comment section down below how you feel about $1.4 billion of taxpayer money going to the CBC each and every year. And it's also important to note, like, there are good people at the CBC. There are good journalists who do good journalism. But come on, I mean, those numbers of managers, of directors, of producers, the CEO making more money than the president of the United States? Like, the waste is there, guys, and it is ridiculous. Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Carson.